Tonight, we follow a sound that was never meant to be heard, a trail of notes buried not in silence, but hidden inside vaults, rewritten manuscripts, and chants stripped of their power. For centuries, the Vatican has shaped not only what people believed, but what they were allowed to hear. Behind the solemn tones of sacred music lies a coded history of intervals forbidden, hymnals erased, and voices altered to serve the pulpit. This isn't just about missing songs or banned instruments. It's about sound itself turned into a weapon, memory controlled by vibration, and melodies that once healed were reduced to whispers no one could sing aloud. Deep inside archives, sealed for generations, are manuscripts that suggest another soundtrack to history, one that could change the way we understand faith, control, and power. So, before you dismiss this as just another legend, ask yourself, what if the holiest songs were the ones you were never allowed to hear? Like the video, subscribe. Because tonight, we step into the Vatican's coded choir, and some voices were silenced for a reason. Imagine stumbling across a piece of music that should not exist. A chant whispered in an old monastery, passed down in silence, its notes strange and unsettling. It feels too advanced for its time, too haunting to have been sung openly, and yet there it is, written in ink that has survived for centuries. The moment you hear it, you realize something powerful. Someone long ago wanted this song to vanish. But why would the Church, the guardian of sacred music, hide a chant from its own flock? What danger could a melody hold that swords and fire could not? The story begins not with silence, but with sound. A single line of music carved into parchment, discovered in the early 20th century by a scholar who quickly realized it was unlike any Gregorian chant he had studied. It shifted in ways chants were not supposed to, carrying intervals that felt almost forbidden. For centuries, the Church had declared which notes were holy, which harmonies lifted the soul toward heaven, and which sounds would drag it down toward chaos. This chant broke the rules. It carried a secret woven into the very structure of its melody. What makes it stranger is how carefully it had been hidden. Most medieval manuscripts were catalogued, recopied, and sung for generations. But this one was tucked away, almost buried, mentioned only in passing within dusty records, as if scribes themselves were afraid to draw too much attention to it. Scholars today debate whether the chant was meant as a prayer, a code, or perhaps a protest, a voice daring to sing what was never meant to be sung. Picture the Europe of the 11th century. Stone cathedrals rising skyward, choirs filling the air with carefully measured hymns, every note chosen to honour God. Yet behind those towering walls, not every voice was in unison. Some monks experimented with tones that stirred too much emotion, sounds that blurred the line between worship and rebellion. The Church saw danger in disorder. Harmony was not just music, it was theology. To break the pattern was to risk breaking the faith, and so anything that strayed too far was silenced. But silence does not erase. The chant survived like a ghost carried through time, a faint reminder that someone was questioning even in an age of obedience. When you listen closely, it feels like a cry that never reached the ears it was meant for. Maybe it was a message smuggled inside music, a code hidden where no one would think to look. After all, parchment can be burned, books can be banned, but a song once sung lodges itself in memory. This is the unsettling truth. History is not just written by victors, it is also sung by choirs, and sometimes what is not sung tells the loudest story of all. Tonight, we begin with a question. If the Church suppressed entire melodies, what truths were buried inside their notes, and why has no one ever been allowed to hear them in full? Step inside a medieval cathedral, and you will understand that sound was never just sound. Every echo, every note, every word from the pulpit was carefully chosen to shape the mind and the soul. The Church understood early on that music carried more than beauty, it carried power. A melody could stir fear, awaken joy, or summon reverence stronger than any sermon. And so the pulpit became not only a place of preaching, but also a stage where the very definition of what counted as holy sound was decided. From the 6th century onward, bishops and abbots gathered not just to debate scripture, but to decide which chants were acceptable before God. They claimed that harmony reflected heaven and disorder mirrored hell. That is why Gregorian chant, simple and solemn, became the voice of the Church. It was not the only music that existed, but it was the one declared divine. To sing outside its rules was to risk being branded as rebellious, even sinful. Imagine being a monk in the 9th century, living in stone walls where silence was considered holy and every sound you made was monitored. You could not simply compose or experiment with melody. You had to follow modes laid down by clerics who believed they were translating the will of God into sound. To break that pattern was more than a mistake. It was a threat to the unity of the faith. The pulpit declared the pitch, and the world was expected to follow. The influence stretched beyond church walls. Villagers sang work songs, soldiers marched to rhythm, children learned prayers through melody. But even these echoes were shaped by the authority of the church. Hymns allowed for peasants had to match the sound of official chant. Folk melodies were often rewritten until they fit the approved scale. The church understood that if you controlled music, you controlled memory. People forget sermons. They do not forget songs. Behind this strict control lay a deeper fear. Music could bypass reason. It could reach the heart without words, and in that hidden channel lay both danger and opportunity. A melody that felt too passionate could move the faithful toward emotions the church could not control. Too much joy, too much grief, too much longing, all of these were suspect. Safer to keep music narrow, solemn, and endlessly repetitive so that no one strayed into dangerous feeling. That is why choirs sang in unison. Harmony was banned for centuries because it created depth, complexity, and unpredictability. Complexity meant questions. Questions meant doubt. The pulpit allowed only the pitch that kept the faithful in line. Yet whispers of disobedience survived. Monks hummed experimental phrases in secret. Travellers carried foreign scales from Byzantium in the Middle East. Sometimes these sounds slipped into local masses, only to be swiftly suppressed. But each suppression revealed the same truth. The church was not just teaching belief, it was tuning the human soul like an instrument. What you heard in church was not only worship, it was programming. And the longer you listened, the more you believed it was the only sound heaven would accept. There is a sound in music that for centuries was whispered about with fear, a sound so unsettling that the church gave it a name straight from the language of demons. They called it the devil in music. Today, we know it as the tritone, the interval that stretches between two notes in a way that feels unstable and tense. It is neither bright nor dark, neither peaceful nor painful. It sits on the edge of harmony like a shadow waiting to fall. To hear it is to feel pulled in two directions at once, and in the Middle Ages that was enough to brand it dangerous. The tritone first appeared in theory books of the 11th century. Musicians noticed it because it was difficult to sing. Choirs trained to glide in smooth unison found themselves stumbling when voices clashed at this strange distance apart. The sound wavered between dissonance and resolution, like a question left hanging in the air. To the church, that instability was more than a musical challenge. It was a spiritual threat. Harmony was supposed to reflect the order of heaven. Every note had its place, just as every angel had its rank. A sound that resisted order felt like rebellion, and rebellion in sound could lead to rebellion in thought. That is why clerics warned singers to avoid it, calling it diabolus in musica. But was this really about demons, or was it about control? Some scholars argue that the fear was less supernatural and more political. The tritone was hard to teach. It pulled music toward complexity and emotion at a time when the church wanted chants simple and uniform. Declaring it evil was a way to keep music within boundaries that priests could manage. If you frightened singers away from an interval, You no longer need to argue about theory. Fear does the work for you. Yet, the forbidden sound never truly disappeared. Composers whispered it into manuscripts with care, disguising it within passing notes, or slipping it between safer intervals. Listeners may not have known why certain chants felt darker or more intense, but the secret was there. A shadowy tension woven into the sacred fabric. Later, in the Renaissance and beyond, the tritone became the heartbeat of drama, used in masses, operas, and eventually even heavy metal centuries later. What had once been outlawed became a symbol of tension and power. But in the age of the medieval pulpit, it was not a choice, it was taboo. Imagine being a young choir boy in the 12th century, told to sing for the glory of God, yet warned that one wrong leap of the voice could call upon evil itself. You would not question the logic, you would simply avoid the sound, carrying that fear for the rest of your life. This is how myths grow, not because they are true, but because they are repeated long enough that no one dares to ask if they ever were. The devil in music was never just an interval. It was a reminder that even the smallest sound could be controlled, silenced, or weaponized to keep the faithful in line. Long before music was written with staffs and notes the way we know today, chants were captured with tiny squiggles floating above words. These marks were called neumes, and they were as mysterious as they were powerful. At first glance, they look like decorations, small strokes and curves that rise and fall like whispers across the page. But in reality, they were the earliest attempt to capture sacred sound on parchment. Yet here lies the hidden truth. Neumes did not show exact pitches. They only suggested whether the voice should move higher or lower, faster or slower. There were no lines, no clear anchors, no way for someone outside the system to reconstruct a melody with certainty. This meant that the knowledge of how a chant actually sounded was passed orally from master to student, from choir leader to choir boy, always inside the cloister walls. The page alone was never enough, and that is exactly how the Church wanted it. By keeping notation vague, the Church ensured that ordinary people could not pick up a manuscript and sing the chants for themselves. Only those trained under clerical authority could unlock the full melody. Neumes became a code, one that preserved the dependence of music on the institution. Imagine being a monk in the 10th century, standing in a dark chapel with only candlelight on the page. The marks above the Latin words guided your memory but could never replace it. If you left the monastery and tried to teach the chant elsewhere, your version might drift, but without the official training of the choir, your melody would never be considered legitimate. In this way, ambiguity became power. It kept control of the sacred sound within the pulpit. There is a deeper question here. Was this lack of clarity simply a stage in the evolution of music writing, or was it deliberately maintained to ensure dependence on the clergy? Some historians suggest that more precise systems could have been developed earlier but were not encouraged because they would have given too much freedom to lay people. If music is the voice of God, then to control how it is sung is to control how people believe. Neumes made the chant uncopyable outside the Church's reach. Only insiders could keep the melody alive. When lines were finally introduced centuries later, turning those floating marks into fixed notes, it was presented as a gift of clarity, but by then the Church had already shaped centuries of music in its image. The earliest generations had grown used to trusting the pulpit to tell them what was correct and what was heresy, and in that trust the true variety of early melodies may have been lost. What we hear today as Gregorian chant might be only the shadow of a much richer soundscape, filtered and narrowed by centuries of controlled memory. The dark squiggles of neumes remind us that even the act of writing music can be used not to reveal, but to hide. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were more than places of prayer. They were the engines of memory, the only places where books were copied by hand and music was preserved for the future. Inside stone walls, Rows of monks bent over wooden desks in rooms called scriptoria, dipping quills into ink and copying line after line, note after note. To the outside world, this might seem like a gift, a devotion to saving knowledge from the chaos beyond the cloister gates. But the truth is more complicated. What was recopied was not everything. It was only what the church decided deserved to survive. Imagine shelves filled with parchment, some crumbling from age, some containing songs that once echoed in villages and royal courts. When the abbot gave the order, certain books were chosen to be copied anew, others left to rot, and some burned. The decisions were rarely explained. A melody too close to folk traditions might vanish. A hymn that used intervals outside of approved modes might never be recopied. And when parchment was scarce, choices had to be made. Those choices shaped what history would hear and what would be lost forever. This silent censorship was more powerful than fire. To destroy a book is violent and obvious, but to quietly refuse to copy it ensures it fades without trace, as if it never existed. Many chants, known only through scattered mentions in letters or marginal notes, vanished this way. A monk might mention a hymn in his diary, but when later generations search for it, the song is gone. It was not preserved in the scriptoria. It was erased by silence. The power of the scriptoria lay in their exclusivity. Only clerics trained in Latin had access, and only the most trusted could handle fragile manuscripts. Lay people never saw the shelves. Choir boys learned the chants by ear, but the books stayed locked away. In this way, the church controlled not just what was sung, but also who could know it. When you control the copying, you control the canon. You decide which voices of the past still speak. Consider how many local traditions may have been lost. In Spain, in France, in the Germanic lands, unique chant families once flourished. Yet, when Rome pushed for uniformity, only Gregorian chant was recopied widely. The rest faded into silence, their manuscripts left behind in forgotten libraries until they crumbled. This was not chance. It was policy. To unify faith under one sound meant to erase all others. Today we hear Gregorian chant and think it is the pure voice of medieval Europe. In truth, it is only the voice that was allowed to survive. Scriptoria of silence were not neutral. They were engines of selection, pruning the vast garden of human music until only one carefully shaped tree remained. And when you stand in a cathedral and hear the chant echo off stone walls, remember that the silence behind those echoes may hold more history than the sound itself. There is a strange story that has echoed through the letters of medieval scholars. A book of chants, often called a codex, was spoken of with reverence but has never been seen. Mentions of it appear in correspondence between abbots, bishops, and even travelling scholars, as if everyone knew it existed, yet no one could put their hands on it. This missing songbook has become more than a mystery. It has become an example of how absence itself can be turned into authority. The codex was rumoured to contain chants, unlike those preserved in ordinary manuscripts. Some said they were older, tracing back to the earliest Christian communities. Others claimed the melodies were filled with unusual intervals, harmonies that sounded too foreign for Rome's comfort. A few even whispered that the book held chants with coded meanings, prayers that doubled as messages for those initiated in secret knowledge. Yet, despite these tantalizing hints, the book itself never surfaced. What is troubling is not simply that the codex is gone, but how its absence was used. In letter after letter, clerics referred to it as the true foundation of the chant tradition, the ultimate source of authority. But when questioned, they admitted no one alive had actually seen it. This meant the missing book could be anything the church wanted it to be. If a chant fit doctrine, it could be said to trace back to the codex. If a chant strayed too far, it could be dismissed as not authentic because it was not part of the codex. In this way, a book that may never have existed became the invisible ruler by which all music was measured. Imagine being a monk who learned a chant from his teacher, a melody filled with passion that stirred his soul. When he presented it at a larger gathering, a bishop might raise a hand and say it was not part of the codex tradition. With that single statement, the chant could be erased from legitimacy, no matter how beautiful it was. The absence of the book became more powerful than any presence. It silenced voices without ever needing to show a page. Historians today debate whether the codex was real, misplaced in some forgotten library, or whether it was an invention, a convenient phantom used to tighten control. If it did exist, its disappearance raises darker questions. Who decided it should be hidden? Was it locked away in the Vatican's archives, sealed because it contained music too dangerous to be heard? Or was it quietly destroyed so that no one could challenge the official story of what chant was meant to be? The missing codex is a reminder that history is not only shaped by what survives, but also by what is said to have existed but cannot be seen. In that silence lies power. For when people believe in a book they can never read, they are forced to trust the voices that claim to speak for it. And that is perhaps the most effective kind of censorship, the kind where belief itself fills the empty space left by a vanished page. On the surface, a medieval chant may seem like nothing more than a prayer carried by music. Yet look closer, and you will find that some chants were not just songs of devotion, they were ciphers, coded messages hidden in plain sound. Scholars have long suspected that certain monks and composers used music as a secret language, embedding puzzles that only the initiated could understand. To most listeners, the chant was holy melody, but to a select few, it was something more, a message tucked into the fabric of worship. One of the simplest tricks was the acrostic. The first letters of each line of text could be arranged to spell out a name, a date, or even a warning. A hymn might seem to praise a saint, but its hidden letters could reveal the name of the abbot who commissioned it, or the initials of a composer who dared not sign his work openly. Another layer was gematria, the use of numbers assigned to letters. In some manuscripts, the sequence of notes mirrored number patterns tied to biblical passages or mystical ideas. To the average monk, the chant was just another melody to memorize, but to those trained in the code, it whispered secrets about creation, prophecy, or hidden doctrine. Even the rhythm of syllables could be manipulated to carry double meaning. Imagine a choir singing the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, with its familiar repetition. But the exact count of phrases might correspond to a sacred number, like 3 for the Trinity, or 7 for divine perfection. To the faithful, it was worship. To the initiated, it was mathematics set to song. Why would monks risk hiding messages inside music? Perhaps it was an act of devotion, a way to praise God with layers of meaning beyond the surface. But there are darker possibilities. Codes could preserve teachings that the pulpit banned, allowing dangerous knowledge to slip through undetected. A chant might sound ordinary to the bishop, yet carry hidden references to cosmology, astronomy, or even pre-Christian traditions. The ambiguity of neumes and early notation made such disguises easier. Without fixed notes, a melody could bend slightly to embed a pattern. Only those taught the key would notice. Over time, whispers grew that some chants held messages for secret brotherhoods, networks of scholars and mystics who believed knowledge had to be preserved even under censorship. If this is true, then the very stones of cathedrals may have echoed with double meanings, prayers for the masses that doubled as passwords for the few. What survives today are hints, suspicious patterns, and marginal notes that suggest more than they prove. But the idea alone is powerful. It reminds us that music was never just background to worship. It was a battlefield of sound, where meaning could be layered, disguised, and smuggled through the air itself. To sing was to pray, but for some, it was also to code, and the choir that seemed united in voice may have been divided in purpose, some praising heaven, others passing secrets, all under the same roof. In the 11th century, a Benedictine monk named Guido of Arezzo introduced a teaching tool that changed music forever. He called it the Guidonian hand. By pointing to different joints on the hand, teachers could show singers where to place each pitch in a scale. For the first time, students did not have to memorize every melody blindly. They could use a visual map, a guide quite literally, in the palm of their hand. It seemed like a breakthrough, a gift of clarity in a world of vague neumes and oral tradition. But every gift of knowledge in the church came with chains. The Guidonian hand was not just a way to learn faster, it was also a way to enforce control. By fixing pitches to specific points, Guido's system narrowed the infinite possibilities of sound into an official framework. Only certain notes were recognized, only certain patterns were taught. To sing outside of that hand was to step outside the church's authority. Imagine being a young choir boy in the 12th century, standing in a cold chapel while your master held up his hand. Each joint represented a sound, each sound locked into the system. You repeated until the pattern became second nature. Soon, you believed those were the only notes that truly existed. Anything else felt wrong, even dangerous. What began as education turned into limitation. This was not accidental. The church wanted singers who could be trained quickly, who would sing in unison without drifting into forbidden intervals or folk melodies. The hand made that possible. It standardized not just learning, but obedience. The more singers relied on it, the less they trusted their own instincts. The very body became a cage, the hand a reminder of the boundaries set by authority. Over time, the Guidonian hand became a symbol of discipline. Teachers raised it like a silent command, guiding voices but also restraining curiosity. While other cultures experimented with wider scales and new tonalities, Europe's choirs remained bound to the fixed joints of Guido's invention. Even when notation grew more advanced, the idea of control through education never faded. To question the system was to question the pulpit, and few dared to risk that. Yet, some traces of resistance slipped through. Composers experimented with new patterns, stretching the framework just enough to create unease. They never admitted it openly, but their music suggests that not everyone accepted the hand as absolute law. Still, the church prevailed. For centuries, generations of singers grew up believing the Guidonian hand was the natural order of music. They never asked what sounds lay beyond its reach. What began as a tool of progress became an invisible fence. The story of the Guidonian hand is not simply about teaching music. It is about how even knowledge itself can be shaped into control. A hand raised in guidance can just as easily become a hand raised in restraint, and in that gesture, an entire continent learned to sing only the notes it was allowed to hear. In medieval Europe, music was not simply measured by sound, it was measured by morality. The church divided chants into modes, patterns of notes that carried different moods. To the modern ear, they sound like ancient scales, but to the faithful, they were far more. Each mode was linked to a spiritual quality, a doorway into the soul. One was solemn, another uplifting, another suited for penitence, another for praise. These were not suggestions, they were rules, taught from the pulpit as if the modes themselves were gifts from heaven. To sing in the wrong mode was to risk singing the wrong truth. Imagine a monk in the 12th century opening a chant book. At the top of the page, the mode was marked like a moral instruction. This one demands humility. This one stirs courage. This one opens the way to sorrow. Every note you sang was coloured by that label, and to stray from it was seen as disorder, even sin. In this way, the church built obedience into the very foundation of sound. Modes became spiritual gatekeepers. If you wanted to reach God through music, you had to pass through their door. The idea was powerful because it blurred the line between art and law. People no longer thought of music as free expression. They thought of it as a system of right and wrong, dictated by tradition and enforced by clergy. To invent a melody outside the accepted modes was not only strange, it was suspicious. Why would you seek another sound if God had already given you the right ones. The system discouraged experimentation and turned composers into servants of doctrine. Even when new ideas entered from the East or from folk traditions, they were pressed into the mould of the modes or discarded entirely. The soundscape of Europe was pruned until only the moral categories of the Church remained. Yet beneath this order, tension grew. The modes did not always match the emotions of real life. People felt grief deeper than the official sorrow mode could carry. They felt joy brighter than the allowed praise mode could contain. And so, small cracks appeared. Singers stretched notes, added ornaments, blurred the rules, smuggling human feeling into the rigid framework. Still, the Church responded by reminding them that sound without obedience was dangerous. The mode was not just a scale, it was a leash. Today, when we listen to Gregorian chant, we hear beauty, calm, and balance. But in the Middle Ages, listeners also heard warning. They knew which mode they were meant to feel and what lesson it carried. Their hearts were guided by a map drawn not by their own voices, but by those who preached from the pulpit. Modes of obedience show us how deeply the Church understood the link between sound and spirit. To control music was to control emotion, and to control emotion was to control belief. In that system, every note was more than a sound. It was an act of submission. When you think of learning music, you might picture the familiar do, re, mi, but in the Middle Ages, the syllables were not fixed, and the story of which one survived is tangled with secrecy and silence. The system began with Guido of Arezzo in the 11th century, who used the hymn to St. John the Baptist to create a teaching pattern. Each line of the hymn began with a different syllable, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. It was a clever way to help singers memorize pitches. Over time, it spread through monasteries and schools, shaping the way generations learned music. Yet there were whispers that other syllables, even other sequences, once existed. Some manuscripts hint at tones linked not only to teaching but to healing. Numbers like 3, 6, 9, repeated in hidden sequences, were tied to chants, said to restore balance to the body or even lift the spirit into higher states of awareness. These tones were sometimes called solfeggio frequencies. Their supporters claimed they were gifts of divine mathematics, vibrations built into creation itself, but they never became part of the official teaching system. Instead, they were sidelined, written out of the manuals, and replaced by the narrow ladder of syllables approved by the Church. Why would such sounds be pushed aside? One answer is control. Teaching music with ut, re, mi was efficient, simple, and easy to enforce. It trained singers to obey a single system that fit the Church's modes and rules. The so-called healing tones, by contrast, suggested a power that did not need clerical permission. If certain vibrations could move the heart or mend the body without words, then they bypassed the pulpit. They gave ordinary people direct access to mystery, something the Church was never comfortable allowing. Imagine a peasant humming a simple melody, unaware that its intervals mirrored one of these sideline tones. To him, it was just a tune. To a monk who recognized it, it might be a sign of danger, a hint of knowledge that should not be spread. Better to erase it from the books than risk the faithful stumbling into forbidden resonance. Over centuries, the memory of these tones faded. The standard system hardened into do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, the pattern we know today. Anything else was dismissed as myth, rumour, or pseudoscience. Yet fragments remained, strange references in old hymns, marginal notes in forgotten manuscripts, and the occasional chant that feels different, vibrating with an intensity that does not match the official scales. Whether these healing tones were real or simply imagined, their erasure tells us something important. Music was not only about beauty or worship, it was about authority. The schism in solfeggio reminds us that what we sing and how we learn it is never neutral. Every syllable carries the weight of history, and behind each simple note there may lie another path, one deliberately closed, waiting for someone brave enough to sing it again. In the early centuries of Christianity, Europe was not united by one single sound. Different regions had their own ways of worship, their own chants that carried the voices of their people. In southern Italy, the Beneventan rite flourished, its melodies filled with unusual turns and haunting rhythms. In Milan, the Ambrosian tradition thrived, claiming roots from Saint Ambrose himself, its chants rich and bold, refusing to disappear even when outsiders tried to silence them. In Spain, before the conquest of the Moors, the Mozarabic chants rose, coloured by influences from both east and west, weaving a soundscape unlike anything in Rome. These were not minor variations. They were living traditions, songs that carried centuries of devotion and culture. But as the papacy grew in power, the goal shifted toward uniformity. To unite the Christian world, Rome insisted that one voice should dominate, one chant above all others. Gregorian chant became the chosen sound, and slowly the regional traditions were trimmed, absorbed, or erased. Imagine a small church in Benevento in the 9th century. The congregation sings the melodies their ancestors have sung for generations, voices lifting with patterns that feel strange to Roman ears. But a decree arrives. These chants are to be replaced by Gregorian forms. Monks travel from Rome carrying new books, new rules, new sounds. The local melodies are tolerated for a time, but each year fewer are sung until they vanish from the living memory of the people. The Ambrosian tradition fought harder. Milan held on to its chants, insisting they were too ancient and too sacred to be erased. Rome tried to suppress them, but never fully succeeded. Even today, traces of Ambrosian chants survive, though surrounded and overshadowed by the Gregorian standard. The Mozarabic tradition was less fortunate. After the Christian reconquest of Spain, the Roman rite was imposed with force. Mozarabic books were burned, choirs silenced, and the chants reduced to fragments preserved only in rare manuscripts. What once filled whole cathedrals became a faint whisper, remembered only by scholars centuries later. The story of these regional rites shows how music was used as a tool of central power. By enforcing one sound across all of Europe, Rome could present itself as the sole voice of God. To sing differently was to appear divided, and division was seen as weakness. Uniformity created authority, but it also created loss. Countless melodies, scales, and rhythms unique to their lands were cut away, like branches trimmed from a tree. The silence they left behind is immeasurable. Today we think of Gregorian chant as the music of the Middle Ages, the timeless voice of the Church. But it is only one thread in a much larger tapestry, a thread chosen because it served the purpose of unity. The others were hidden, neglected, or deliberately erased. The voices of Benevento, Milan, and Spain remind us that history is never just what survives. It is also what was silenced, and in those silences lie the forgotten songs of entire peoples. In the grand cathedrals of medieval Europe, the faithful gathered to hear choirs fill the air with chants of devotion. But behind the curtain, in private chapels and secret rehearsal rooms, another kind of music was unfolding. Music never meant for common ears. These were the sounds reserved for the powerful, melodies polished in secrecy and unveiled only in the presence of bishops, popes, and kings. To the public, worship seemed uniform, but behind closed doors, the soundscape was far more complex. Certain compositions were considered too refined, too experimental, or too sacred to be released into the world of peasants and villagers. They were treasures of sound, guarded like relics. In the Vatican itself, choirs practiced in hidden chambers where the walls absorbed every note. Rehearsals went late into the night, voices shaping music that blurred the line between devotion and spectacle. Sometimes these pieces were performed once, and then locked away, their manuscripts copied only for the eyes of clerical elites. Ordinary believers would never know such music existed. Imagine a chapel lit only by candles, its doors closed to the crowd. A choir stands in formation, rehearsing a motet with complex harmonies far beyond the simple chants heard on Sunday mornings. The sound swirls, overwhelming and almost intoxicating. The bishop, listening in his chair, nods in approval, not because the piece uplifts the people, but because it elevates his authority. Music in this setting was power theatre. To hear it was a privilege. To control it was a statement of dominance. Some of the most secretive rehearsals were linked to ceremonies of initiation, moments when new clerics or chosen nobles were brought into inner circles of influence. The music sung at these times often carried layers of symbolism, texts altered or hidden, harmonies chosen to create awe. These sounds reinforced the idea that the church held mysteries far beyond what the ordinary ear could grasp. For the common worshipper in the nave, music was stripped down to simple unison chant. For the elite, it was layered, rich, and intoxicating. The contrast itself was deliberate. By restricting access, the church turned music into a currency of status. Those who ruled heard more. Those who obeyed heard less. Over time, this secrecy became part of tradition. Certain manuscripts were copied only once and kept in locked chests. Choir members were sworn to silence about what they rehearsed. Even today, scholars suspect that some of the most remarkable medieval compositions remain hidden in archives, never published because they were never meant to reach the outside world. The choir behind the curtain reminds us that sound can be divided just like land or wealth. What the public hears is not always the whole truth. The most beautiful and daring works were kept in the shadows, shared only with those who held power. And so history does not only hide what was destroyed, it also hides what was never allowed to be heard at all, songs of wonder silenced not by fire or censorship, but by privilege. There is a sound that shakes stone walls, a sound so massive it feels like the breath of heaven itself. The pipe organ, with its rows of towering pipes and its thunderous voice, became one of the most powerful instruments in all of history. But in the Middle Ages, it was also one of the most feared. There were times when the church itself ordered organs dismantled, silenced, and in some cases even banned. The reason was not because the organ was unholy, but because it was too powerful, too capable of stirring emotions that the pulpit could not fully control. Imagine sitting in a cathedral around the 12th century. The choir sings a steady chant, calm and predictable. Then suddenly the organ roars, filling the air with waves of sound that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Your chest vibrates, your skin tingles, and you feel emotions you cannot name. For some, this was a glimpse of heaven. For the church leaders watching nervously, it was a glimpse of chaos. They feared that music, this overwhelming, could incite the flesh, awaken feelings of passion or ecstasy that had no place in solemn prayer. To them, sound was supposed to lift the soul quietly toward God. The organ threatened to shake it loose. Records from medieval councils tell of organs being criticized for distracting the faithful. Some claimed the instrument made worship feel like theatre rather than devotion. Others argued its massive size and strange mechanics carried echoes of pagan spectacle. There were even whispers that the organ's ability to mimic thunder, wind, and even voices was unnatural, a trick that could tempt believers into confusing divine inspiration with human invention. In some monasteries, abbots ordered the pipes sealed, leaving the instrument standing silent for decades. In others, entire organs were dismantled and their parts scattered, as if silencing the machine would restore purity to prayer. And yet, the organ never truly disappeared. In certain cathedrals it survived, played softly in private chapels, or brought out only for rare festivals. Its voice lingered, waiting for a time when the church's suspicion would fade. By the Renaissance, the organ had returned in full glory, embraced as the king of instruments, but its earlier history of fear and suppression was quietly forgotten. What makes this story unsettling is how the same sound could be called holy one century and heretical the next. The organ was never just an instrument, it was a test of control. When its voice was allowed, it expanded the imagination of the faithful, offering glimpses of the infinite. When it was silenced, it reminded people that even sound itself was subject to the will of authority. The sealed pipes stand as a symbol, not of music lost to time, but of music deliberately muted, locked away out of fear that the human heart, once moved too deeply, might wander beyond the reach of the pulpit. In the early centuries of Christian worship, the rule was simple: one voice, one melody, one prayer sung in unison. But as music evolved, something new began to spread through cathedrals. Singers layered voices on top of one another, weaving harmonies that shimmered with beauty and complexity. This was polyphony, and to many it felt like ecstasy, a sound that lifted the spirit far beyond the plain chant of old. Yet to others, it was dangerous, a cloud that obscured the clarity of Scripture. The debate soon grew fierce, turning polyphony into something of a trial. Imagine stepping into Notre Dame of Paris in the 13th century. The choir begins a piece with multiple lines of music. Each voice takes a different path, rising, twisting, and rejoining in waves of sound that fill the vast stone arches. The effect is overwhelming, almost intoxicating. Worshippers stand in awe, some with tears in their eyes, but the bishop frowns, for while the music dazzles, the words of the sacred text are blurred. Instead of Scripture ringing clear, syllables are stretched, doubled, and drowned in a sea of harmony. To church leaders, this was not beauty, it was excess. Critics accused polyphony of turning prayer into performance. They warned that the faithful came not to hear God's word, but to enjoy musical spectacle. Some even claimed that such indulgence lured worshippers toward vanity and pride. The Council of Trent in the 16th century took these concerns seriously, with heated debates over whether polyphony should be banned entirely. Voices argued that music must serve Scripture, never overshadow it. Polyphony, they said, made the divine text unreadable to the ear. And yet, composers refused to abandon the form. They believed harmony revealed deeper truths, that layers of sound mirrored the complexity of heaven itself. Men like Léonin and Perrotin pushed boundaries at Notre Dame, writing works that turned the cathedral into an ocean of sound. Later, Palestrina was said to have written a mass so clear and balanced that it convinced the council to spare polyphony. Whether the story is fact or myth, it reflects the tension between restraint and freedom that haunted the church. At its heart, the trial of polyphony was never only about music, it was about control. One voice in unison symbolized obedience. Many voices moving independently suggested freedom, even individuality. For authorities who valued uniformity, that independence felt threatening. To allow polyphony was to risk giving people a taste of what it meant to exist outside the single line. Yet history shows that suppression never lasts forever. The more the church tried to restrain layered music, the more it spread, carried by choirs, composers, and the sheer human hunger for beauty. Polyphony survived its trial, but the shadow of suspicion never fully left. Even today, when we hear medieval harmonies, they carry with them the echo of an old debate, a reminder that sound itself was once accused of being too beautiful for faith to bear. When the great councils of the church gathered, the world expected thunderous decrees and unshakable laws. But when it came to music, much of the power was hidden not in what was spoken loudly, but in what was whispered between the lines. Official statements were often short, vague, and carefully worded, yet their impact stretched for centuries. The Council of Trent in the 16th century is the most famous example. Its documents say little about music directly, only that worship should remain clear and free from distractions. But everyone in attendance knew what those words implied. They were aimed at the growing complexity of polyphony, at choirs whose dazzling harmonies risked making Scripture unintelligible. Though the council never outright banned such music, the silence was as heavy as any prohibition. Composers understood the warning. Bishops returned home with instructions that did not need to be written down. The real decisions were whispered in closed rooms, where clergy debated which sounds elevated faith and which ones undermined authority. Imagine being a composer during this time. Officially, you were free to write. Nothing in the decrees said you could not, but the whispers made their way to you. Keep the words audible. Do not let vanity cloud prayer. Simplicity above all. These were not laws you could point to, but expectations that could ruin you if ignored. It was censorship without fingerprints, a form of control that worked precisely because it was never spelled out. Earlier councils had done the same. In the Middle Ages, synods gathered to address what instruments were appropriate in church. Rarely did they issue direct bans, but their language about avoiding excess was enough to silence organs in certain regions and keep drums out of the liturgy. No canon law needed to be written. The whispers were sufficient. This method gave the church flexibility. By avoiding explicit rules, they could adapt to circumstances, allowing certain practices in one place while condemning them in another. It also protected them from being challenged. A law can be debated, a whisper cannot. Those who resisted had little ground to stand on, for the prohibition was never official, yet everyone knew it was real. Over time, this shadow system of guidance shaped the entire history of sacred music. What we hear today as Gregorian chant, solemn and uniform, is not just the result of musical taste. It is the result of countless implied rules passed down through council halls, instructions carried in the margins rather than the decrees. And perhaps the most striking fact is how effective this approach was. Music that stirred too much passion, music that strayed too far from doctrine, rarely survived, not because it was outlawed, but because it was quietly discouraged into silence. Council whispers remind us that history is not only shaped by written law, but by what is never written at all. And sometimes the faintest guidance, spoken behind closed doors, leaves the deepest echo in the songs that remain. The story has been told for centuries like a rescue tale. The Council of Trent, worried that polyphony was drowning out scripture, prepared to ban complex music from the church altogether. Then came Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, the composer who supposedly saved sacred music. According to the legend, he wrote a mass so pure, so balanced, that it proved harmony and holiness could coexist. His Missa Papae Marcelli was said to have convinced the council that polyphony could remain if guided by restraint. Ever since, Palestrina has been celebrated as the saviour of church music, the man who kept beauty alive when silence threatened to take over. But the truth is more tangled, and the legend may have been more convenient than real. For one thing, the council never officially banned polyphony. Its decrees spoke only of clarity and devotion, leaving room for interpretation. The story of Palestrina swooping in to rescue music seems to have emerged later, built up by admirers who wanted a hero and by clerics who wanted a neat explanation. In reality, the decision to preserve polyphony was less about one composer's genius and more about the church curating what styles it would allow. Palestrina became the perfect symbol because his music fit the mould. His lines were smooth, his harmonies rich but never overwhelming, his treatment of text careful. He showed restraint, and restraint was exactly what the church wanted to promote. By elevating him as the example, the Vatican could quietly dismiss other composers whose works pushed boundaries too far. Imagine dozens of manuscripts filled with daring harmonies, bold experiments, and passionate dissonances. None of those would be held up as models, even if they were equally skilled. They were trimmed away, left in archives, or never recopied, while Palestrina's pieces were copied again and again until they defined the standard of sacred sound. The legend worked because it simplified the story. It told the world that polyphony was spared thanks to one faithful servant of the church. It masked the fact that music had been curated, narrowed, and shaped to serve authority. Palestrina's reputation grew into myth, a convenient shield for deeper acts of control. To question the system was harder when everyone believed the system had already been saved. This does not diminish Palestrina's genius. His music is breathtaking and deserves admiration, but the myth around him shows how history often hides complexity beneath a single name. By turning him into a hero, the Church avoided revealing how much music it had silenced, and that silence still lingers. For every piece of Palestrina we can hear today, there may have been dozens of others erased to keep the canon clean. The legend of Palestrina is not only about one man's gift, it is about how myth can rewrite memory, turning an act of restriction into a story of salvation. And sometimes, the most dangerous stories are not the ones we are forbidden to tell, but the ones we are taught to believe without question. When people hear the phrase index of forbidden books, they imagine lists carefully guarded by the Vatican, titles declared dangerous, authors silenced by decree, but there was another kind of index, one rarely written down, that shaped history just as much. It was the Index of Forbidden Melodies, an unwritten repertoire filter that decided which tunes would survive in worship and which ones would vanish without a trace. Unlike books, melodies did not need to be banned with fanfare. They could simply be retired, dismissed as unfit, and allowed to fade in silence. The effect was the same as burning a manuscript, yet far more subtle. Imagine a choir rehearsing a chant that stirred too much emotion, its intervals bending the rules of accepted modes. The bishop listens and shakes his head. He declares that it clouds the clarity of prayer. From that moment, the chant is retired, removed from the repertoire, never to be sung again. No parchment is destroyed, no public condemnation is made. The chant simply stops echoing through the walls of the cathedral, and soon no one remembers it existed. This quiet erasure was effective because music lives only in performance. A melody not sung is a melody already dead. Even if fragments lingered in manuscripts, they became useless once choirs were forbidden to use them. Over generations, the filter grew tighter. Folk-inspired tunes were judged too secular. Melodies that leaned toward theatrical drama were said to tempt the flesh. Anything resembling dance was instantly suspect. The line between holy and unholy was drawn not only by theology, but also by taste, and taste was defined by those in power. The faithful never knew what they were missing, because the missing music left no scars. Unlike books placed on the official index, there was no record to rebel against, no list to question, only silence where once there had been sound. This made the Index of Forbidden Melodies more insidious than any public ban. It shaped culture invisibly, rewriting memory without leaving evidence. Today, when historians look back, they find curious gaps. Manuscripts mention chants by name, but the music itself is gone. Others survive in fragments but show signs of having been crossed out, their notation scratched or left unfinished. These clues suggest a pattern, but never the full picture. We will never know how many thousands of tunes were erased through this repertoire filter. What we do know is that those which survived fit a very narrow image of worship, solemn, restrained, and controllable. Anything that might have opened new paths of feeling or thought was quietly removed. The Index of Forbidden Melodies was never a book on a shelf. It was a system whispered from choirmaster to bishop, from council to monastery, until it became instinct. Sing only what is approved, leave the rest in silence. And that silence is what echoes most clearly today, louder than any chant that survived, a reminder that history can be edited not only with fire, but with forgetting. There was a time when the most coveted sound in Europe did not come from instruments or choirs of monks, but from voices that were never meant to exist. The castrati, boys altered before puberty to preserve their high range, became the prized singers of the church. Their voices carried both the purity of a child and the power of a grown man, a combination that felt otherworldly. To hear them was to feel heaven descend, or so the listeners believed. But behind that sound lay a bargain both dark and hidden, a bargain the church valued yet rarely admitted. The practice grew in the 16th and 17th centuries when women were forbidden from singing in church choirs. Choirs needed high voices, and boys eventually grew too deep. The solution was brutal. Some families, desperate for fortune, agreed to have their sons castrated so that their voices would remain forever high. Those who survived the dangerous procedure trained in special schools and, if talented enough, were recruited into the chapels of Rome. The Vatican itself employed dozens of castrati in the Sistine Chapel choir, where their soaring voices filled the private masses of popes and cardinals. In public, the church spoke little of how these voices were created. To admit it openly was to acknowledge the cruelty behind the beauty. Instead, the music was allowed to speak for itself, leaving audiences awestruck and silent. The bargain was clear. The church gained the perfect sound for worship, and the bodies of young boys paid the price. Imagine standing in St. Peter's Basilica in the 18th century. The air vibrates as a castrato sings a line that rises higher and higher, never breaking, never losing strength. The sound is not quite human, not quite angelic. It feels like a bridge between earth and heaven, and yet in that moment of awe lies a truth no one dares to speak. The voice exists only because of a choice that forever denied the singer a normal life. Castrati became stars, some showered with wealth and fame, yet many lived in loneliness, their bodies reminders of a system that valued sound over humanity. The church both celebrated and concealed them. Their voices were preserved in sacred works, but their names were often hidden. Official records rarely acknowledged the practice, as if silence could erase the cost. Over time, critics began to question whether such voices were truly divine, or whether they were evidence of an institution willing to sacrifice human dignity for control over sound. By the late 19th century, the practice was outlawed, but not before centuries of music had been shaped by it. The last castrato recordings from the early 20th century sound ghostly, the fading echo of a tradition built on secrecy. The castrato bargain shows us that even the most heavenly sounds can carry shadows. The church prized the voice, but hid the body, lifting the music while silencing the truth. And behind every soaring note was a reminder that power often demands sacrifices, even from those who never chose to give them. In the villages of medieval Europe, music did not only belong to cathedrals and monasteries. It lived in the fields, the markets, and the narrow streets where peasants sang while they worked or celebrated. Their songs were simple, filled with repetition and rhythm, easy to remember and easy to pass along. During festivals and processions, these melodies spilled into the porches of churches, carried by the people who believed that their voices, too, could praise God. Yet, as these folk hymns reached the edge of sacred space, something happened. They were folded away, altered, or quietly erased. The church welcomed devotion, but feared the unregulated sound of the crowd. To clergy trained in solemn chant, the lively energy of folk tunes felt unruly, even dangerous. The rhythms suggested dance, the refrains echoed laughter, and the melodies often carried traces of older pagan traditions. Allowing such songs inside risked blurring the line between sacred worship and common festivity. And so the porches of the church became a boundary. At the door, the voices of the people were softened, tamed, or silenced. Some folk hymns were domesticated, rewritten into more acceptable forms. A melody that once accompanied harvest dances might be slowed down, its text replaced with Latin words, and sung in processions with a veneer of holiness. Others were dismissed entirely. Priests declared them unfit, and over generations they faded from memory. The people who once sang them in joy began to forget, or they sang them only in secret, outside the earshot of authority. Imagine a spring procession in a small French village. The peasants approach the church carrying flowers, their children singing a lively tune that has been sung for generations. At the porch, the priest stops them. He thanks them for their devotion, but asks them to sing instead from the approved hymn book. The old song falls silent, replaced by the monotone of a chant no one in the crowd truly knows. In that moment, a piece of culture vanishes, folded away by authority. Over time, this filtering reshaped what history remembers as sacred music. Gregorian chant came to represent the sound of medieval faith, but it was only part of the picture. The countless songs of the people, once just as vital to devotion, were erased or transformed until they no longer carried their original spirit. A few fragments survive in manuscripts, notated hastily by clerics who disapproved, or preserved in folk traditions passed down orally. But most are gone, lost not to fire or war but to silence imposed at the church door. The story of these folded away hymns shows how control works not only by forbidding but by reshaping. Music was not destroyed outright, but bent until it fit the narrow mould of obedience. The sound of the people was pushed aside so that only the sound of the pulpit remained. And yet, if you listen carefully in some remote villages even today, you may still hear echoes of those forgotten tunes, reminders that not all voices can be erased, even when silenced at the porch of the church. When the Jesuit order was founded in the 16th century, it quickly became more than a group of missionaries. It was a network of teachers, thinkers, and strategists whose influence stretched across continents. Their tools were not only books and sermons, but also sound itself. The Jesuits understood that music could shape the soul, sharpen the mind, and even soften resistance in distant lands. This sensitivity became known as the Jesuit ear, a way of listening and teaching that tuned entire societies to their rhythm. In Europe, Jesuit schools trained generations of boys in music alongside theology and philosophy. Choir practice was not simply about singing, it was about discipline, unity, and obedience. To blend your voice into a group was to learn to submit to a higher order. The exercises drilled precision, demanding that each note be sung in tune, each rhythm perfectly aligned. A Jesuit-trained ear was an obedient ear, conditioned to recognize harmony as virtue and dissonance as disorder. But the Jesuit ear reached far beyond Europe. As the order expanded into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, music became a tool of empire. In China, Jesuit missionaries introduced Western notation and instruments, carefully weaving them into court rituals. They taught that harmony in music mirrored harmony in society, appealing to Confucian ideals. In South America, they used choirs to convert indigenous peoples, teaching them polyphonic hymns that blended European style with local languages. To the Jesuits, this was not cultural mixing. It was tuning the world to their key. Acoustics played a role as well. Jesuits were among the first to study how sound behaved in large spaces. They designed chapels where the architecture amplified choirs, making voices seem larger than life. A small group of singers could fill an entire hall, overwhelming listeners and creating the impression of divine presence. This was not accidental, it was strategy. The Jesuit ear was trained not only to hear music, but to control how others heard it. Imagine walking into a mission church in 17th century Brazil. Indigenous singers chant in perfect harmony under the direction of a Jesuit teacher. The stone walls make their voices echo like thunder, leaving the congregation awestruck. For many, the sound itself feels like proof of the church's power. Yet behind the beauty lies a careful system of control. The Jesuits tuned voices, trained ears, and shaped emotions until communities began to associate order, truth, and authority with the harmonies they heard. Over centuries, this approach created a musical empire, one that reached into education, worship, and even politics. The Jesuit ear became a symbol of how knowledge and power could travel through sound. It reminds us that music is never neutral. To teach someone how to listen is to teach them how to believe. And when the Jesuits tuned the world, they were not only spreading faith, they were writing history in notes and echoes, one voice at a time, When European missionaries carried hymnals into the colonies, they brought more than words of faith. They carried an entire system of sound meant to overwrite the voices already rooted in those lands. Indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, and Asia had their own scales, their own rhythms, their own ways of singing to the divine. Some were based on pentatonic scales, others on intricate microtones, and many tied directly to ceremonies that bound communities together. But once the colonial hymnals arrived, those local sounds were declared unfit for worship. The mission fields became muted fields, places where centuries of song were replaced by the narrow tones of Europe. Imagine a village in 17th century Mexico. The people gather around a fire, singing in a scale that bends notes just enough to sound unlike anything from Rome. The rhythm matches the beating of drums, the melody winding like a river. Then missionaries arrive with books of hymns written in neat staves, each line carrying the order of Gregorian chant. The villagers are taught to repeat, to flatten their voices into the imported modes. The old scale is called pagan, the drum is silenced, and the hymn is sung in unison as if it had always been that way. This pattern repeated across continents. In South America, Jesuits trained choirs of indigenous boys to sing polyphony in Latin, their natural inflections erased by endless drills. In Africa, local call and response traditions were folded into hymns but stripped of their original meaning. In Asia, tonal languages clashed with Western scales, yet still the hymnals forced voices into European molds. Some traces of native music survived, but only in hidden ways. A melody might linger as an undercurrent, woven softly beneath the imported hymn. A rhythm might slip into the cadence of clapping hands, disguised as enthusiasm for the new faith. Over time, these fragments blended with the imposed structures, creating hybrid sounds that scholars today call syncretic traditions. Yet it is important to remember that these hybrids often existed not out of choice, but out of necessity. Whole scales and systems of sound were overwritten, judged incompatible with Christian worship. What survived did so in the margins. The colonial hymnals left behind a strange silence. Manuscripts carefully catalogued European music in mission churches, while the voices of the people outside those walls went unrecorded. Historians now search for traces in oral traditions, piecing together what was lost by listening to the songs that slipped past the censors. The story of these muted fields is not only about suppression, but also about resilience. Even under pressure, communities found ways to keep their voices alive. A funeral chant in the Andes might still carry the old scale beneath the Latin words. A lullaby in the Philippines might mask its rhythm within a Christian prayer. These are reminders that sound cannot be erased completely. It bends, hides, and waits. Yet the colonial hymnals reveal the cost of control. They show how music can be used as a tool of empire, a way to silence a people, not by taking their land, but by reshaping the very air their voices once filled. In the heart of the Vatican, and in countless monasteries across Europe, there were always rooms filled with shelves of parchment and songbooks. These were the archives, the places where music was supposed to be preserved for generations. Yet preservation was never neutral. Every manuscript, locked behind wooden doors, was subject to rules of permission, provenance, and the long machinery of bureaucracy. At the centre of this quiet system stood the librarian's key, both a literal object and a symbol of control. To read a book of chant, you needed approval. To copy a manuscript, you needed even more. Access was not open but filtered through layers of authority. Imagine a scholar arriving in the 17th century, eager to study a chant rumoured to contain unusual intervals. He is told he may look at one manuscript, but not another. He must write his request, wait for signatures, and accept that some shelves are forever closed. No explanation is given. The librarian shrugs and turns the key, and that is the end of the matter. Over time, this process became a kind of censorship by slowness. The chants not considered useful were left uncopied. The manuscripts deemed sensitive were locked away until curiosity faded. A melody ignored for 100 years became a melody forgotten. Bureaucracy did not destroy knowledge in fire, it smothered it quietly in dust. Provenance was another gate. If a piece of music could not be traced to a respectable source, it was dismissed. A chant from a folk tradition had no standing. A melody linked to a condemned monk could not be trusted. Without a proper pedigree, the music was shelved in obscurity. In this way, history was pruned like a garden, with only certain branches allowed to grow. What remained gave the impression of completeness, yet it was already curated. The librarian's key decided what scholars centuries later would believe was the whole record. What makes this system so effective is its invisibility. There was no grand decree saying a chant was forbidden. There was simply a locked door, a missing copy, or a delay that stretched for decades. By the time anyone asked again, the music was gone from living memory. This slow forgetting has shaped how we understand sacred music today. Gregorian chant seems eternal and uniform because that is what survived the archive. The regional, the strange, the experimental often never made it past the gate. The key guarded not only the shelves, but also the story of history itself. Even now, researchers working in the Vatican archives face strict limits. They may request one manuscript at a time. They may not photograph freely. They are told where to look and where not to. The tradition continues, a balance of preservation and restriction, of memory carefully rationed. The librarian's key reminds us that forgetting does not always happen by accident. Sometimes it is built into the very system of preservation, where silence is created not by fire or loss, but by the slow turning of a lock. There are scattered accounts in old letters and chronicles of chants that did more than lift the spirit. They seem to touch the body itself, calming fevers, easing pain, or stirring emotions so strongly that people wept uncontrollably. Certain intervals, sung in precise patterns, were said to create effects beyond ordinary music. Instead of being celebrated, these effects often became a reason for restriction. The chant that healed too much was seen not as a blessing, but as a threat to control. Imagine a small monastery in the 12th century. A brother falls ill, burning with fever. Other monks gather around and sing a particular melody, known only within their order. By the end of the night, the brother's breathing steadies, his strength returning. Word spreads through the village that the monks possess a song of healing. Soon, people come knocking, begging to hear it, not for prayer but for relief. To the abbots, this is dangerous. Worship is meant to point toward God, not become a tool of medicine. The chant is ordered to be kept within the cloister, never sung in public again. Stories like this echo across centuries. Some theorists believe that intervals vibrated in ways that matched the human body, aligning with pulse, breath, and even mood. The tritone was feared for causing unrest. Other intervals, gentle and resonant, were thought to soothe or repair. The very possibility that sound could alter the body frightened authorities, for it suggested that healing might come not through relics, sacraments, or clerical intercession, but through vibration itself. If peasants discovered they could find comfort in song without stepping into a church, what power would the pulpit lose? And so chants rumoured to carry strong effects were quietly retired. Manuscripts were recopied without those pages. Choirs were told to stick to safer tones, those that inspired devotion but nothing more. Over time, the memory of these chants slipped into legend. Some survived as fragments in folk songs, others as strange marginal notes hinting at lost intervals. Modern researchers argue that these healing tones might have been early forms of resonance therapy centuries before science gave it a name. Yet, the fact remains that they were silenced, not because they failed, but because they worked too well. The chant that heals too much reveals a paradox. In a world that claimed to believe in miracles, not all miracles were welcome. The Church accepted healing when it came through prayer to saints or the laying on of relics. But when healing seemed to come directly from sound, it bypassed authority. Power depends on mediation, on being the gate between people and the divine. A chant that could touch the body without permission undermined that gate, so it was hidden. The silence left behind is haunting. We may never know what those chants truly sounded like, only that once upon a time music may have carried more than beauty. It may have carried power, and that power was too much for those who feared what it might free. The silencing of a melody rarely happened with a grand decree. More often it unfolded quietly, step by step, until a song that once echoed through churches was gone without anyone daring to ask why. The anatomy of a ban was a process of subtle moves, each one small enough to avoid scandal, but together powerful enough to erase music from memory. It began with suspicion. A bishop or choirmaster would raise concerns about a particular tune. Perhaps it stirred too much joy, or its rhythm reminded people of dancing, or its intervals carried associations with folk songs outside the church. The suspicion was not shouted from the pulpit, but noted in meetings, passed along in whispers, planting seeds of doubt. Next came restriction. The melody would be removed from major feasts and ceremonies, kept only for lesser occasions. A chant once sung at Easter might be moved to an ordinary Sunday. This small shift diminished its importance without sparking protest. The faithful still heard it, but less often, and so its place in their hearts began to fade. Then came omission. When new hymnals or chant books were copied in the scriptoria, the melody simply failed to appear. A scribe, instructed by superiors, left it out. There was no need to destroy the old copies. Over time, they wore out, faded, or were locked away in libraries, while the new uniform books spread everywhere. Within a generation, most singers had never learned the tune at all. Finally came forgetting. Once the melody stopped being sung, it ceased to exist in living memory. Parishioners who had once loved it grew old and died. The young grew up without ever knowing it had been part of worship. By then, there was no need for condemnation or explanation. The silence was the ban, and it carried no scandal because no one remembered to question. Imagine a chant once beloved in a small Italian town. For decades, it was the highlight of a festival, its melody rising above the crowd like sunlight. Then one year, the choirmaster introduces a new piece, praising its clarity and purity. The old chant is pushed aside. The next year, it is not included at all. Within 10 years, no one sings it. Within 50, no one even knows its name. What was once alive becomes nothing more than a fragment in an unused manuscript. This quiet process of banning was efficient because it left no visible wound. People did not mourn what they no longer remembered. The church avoided scandal by replacing, rather than denouncing, by editing instead of erasing in public. To modern eyes, this looks like conspiracy, but to those living it, it felt natural, even invisible. The anatomy of a ban shows us that censorship does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it works not by forbidding, but by forgetting. And in that slow silence, entire songs can vanish without leaving even a trace of rebellion behind. When music first moved from handwritten manuscripts to printed pages, it seemed like the dawn of uniformity. Printing promised consistency, the ability to spread the same hymn or chant to hundreds of churches without the errors of tired scribes. But early printers were not just silent servants of the church. Some used their craft to slip in small acts of defiance. Marginal notes, strange symbols, and deliberate misprints became a secret language. Historians call it the printer's wink, a quiet signal to those who knew how to read between the lines. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, music printing was expensive and risky. The church kept close watch, eager to ensure only approved melodies filled the pews. Yet the printing press was hard to control completely. A single workshop could produce hundreds of copies before censors even knew what was inside. This gave printers an unusual kind of power. Some obeyed strictly, but others resisted in ways too small to punish, yet too clever to miss. Imagine holding a hymn book printed in Venice around the year 1500. The page looks ordinary at first glance, filled with notes and staves, but in the margin, a tiny mark appears, a star or a flower that does not belong. To the average singer, it means nothing. To those in the know, it signals that the melody has been altered from the official version. The tune may contain an interval long considered forbidden, or a rhythm reminiscent of local folk songs. The mark tells the initiated where to look. At other times, resistance came in the form of deliberate typos. A text might carry one syllable out of place, changing the way the chant is sung. A single misprinted note could preserve a hidden version of a melody, disguised as an error. Because printing mistakes were common, these small changes passed unnoticed by most. But to careful readers, they were clues that not all had been surrendered to censorship. Errata sheets added another layer of intrigue. When mistakes were discovered, printers issued corrections. Sometimes the so-called correction restored the official version, but sometimes it pointed readers to alternatives. A printer sympathetic to local traditions could use an errata sheet to smuggle in variants that would otherwise have been forbidden. Over time, these winks created a shadow history of music. While the official hymnals gave the impression of perfect order, the margins and misprints preserved fragments of what was being erased. Scholars today find these traces scattered across old books, small reminders that even in an age of control, human creativity found cracks to slip through. The printer's wink reminds us that silence is never absolute. Even when the Church sought to enforce uniformity through the power of the press itself resisted in whispers. A dot, a misplaced note, a curious symbol in the corner of a page, all became acts of quiet rebellion. And while most singers never noticed, the survival of these small details proves that some truths can only be kept alive, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows of ink. The Kyrie, one of the most ancient parts of the Mass, begins with a plea for mercy. Its words are simple, repeated in waves, yet beneath those familiar syllables, some composers left puzzles hidden in plain sight. Case studies of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts reveal that certain Kyries contain more than notes. They carry dates, names, and even crude maps embedded within their musical patterns. To the ordinary ear, these chants sound like any other, but to the initiated, they whispered secrets across generations. One famous example comes from a 15th century Mass attributed to an anonymous composer in France. At first glance, the Kyrie looks ordinary, a steady flow of neumes written in black ink on red lines. But when scholars charted the intervals numerically, they discovered a sequence that matched the year 1453, the date of the fall of Constantinople. The Kyrie, sung in churches across Europe, carried within it a hidden memorial to a city lost to the Ottomans. Worshippers sang mercy, not knowing they were also singing history. Another case appears in a manuscript linked to northern Italy. The Kyrie section of the Mass includes a recurring pattern of notes that, when mapped against letters, spelled out a name. It was not the name of God or a saint, but of a local patron who had secretly funded the choir. The message was invisible to the congregation, but visible to singers who studied the score closely. In this way, the Kyrie became a monument of gratitude, smuggled into sacred space without breaking the rules of devotion. Perhaps the strangest case comes from Spain, where a 16th century Kyrie appears to contain a map. The contour of its melodic rise and fall matches the outline of the Iberian Peninsula. Some scholars dismiss this as coincidence, but others argue it was intentional, a way of embedding geography into liturgy. To those who could read the lines, the music itself became a chart of homeland and identity at a time when borders and faith were in constant tension. These hidden codes reveal that composers were not merely craftsmen of sound. They were also guardians of memory and meaning, slipping messages into music where no censor would think to look. The Kyrie was the perfect place for such secrets, because it was repeated so often that no one would suspect it contained anything unusual. To the ear, it was devotion. To the eye of a skilled reader, it was something more. The use of codes in sacred music also reflects the deep connection between number, letter, and tone in medieval thought. Music was not only art, but mathematics, a structure that could carry hidden truths as securely as any locked chest. By embedding dates, names, or maps into their chants, composers transformed worship into a coded archive. Today, these patterns are only beginning to be rediscovered. They remind us that beneath the plain surface of sacred music lies a hidden world where songs were more than prayers. They were messages, monuments, and sometimes even warnings carried across centuries in the humble notes of a Kyrie. There were times when writing down a melody was not safe. Ink on parchment could be confiscated, inspected, or burned. A song that carried forbidden intervals, folk influences, or coded meanings risked vanishing if it ever left a trace on paper. And so, music found another kind of vault, one that no inquisitor could easily search. It lived in memory, stored in the voices of choir boys who carried chants in their minds like hidden treasures. In the medieval and early Renaissance world, oral tradition was already powerful. Most people learned music by ear long before they saw notation. But when certain melodies became suspect, or when scribes were ordered to exclude them, memory became the only way they survived. Choir boys, trained to sing dozens of pieces by heart, became walking libraries. Their voices held the archives that the shelves were forbidden to keep. Imagine a young boy in a monastery around the year 1300. He rehearses daily with older singers, repeating melodies until they settle deep inside him. Some of the chants he learns never appear in the books he copies in the scriptorium. They are passed only from mouth to ear, taught in whispers during rehearsals. The boy does not question why. He only knows that these tunes must be remembered. When he grows older and joins another choir in a different city, he carries those melodies with him, sharing them with new singers who keep the chain alive. This fragile network of memory allowed certain pieces to slip through the cracks of censorship. While manuscripts grew standardized, oral tradition remained unpredictable. Songs traveled across borders, mutating slightly with each retelling, but preserving fragments that would otherwise have been lost. Historians now believe that many regional chants survived in this way, sustained not by ink, but by the resilience of human recall. Memory, however, was both a strength and a risk. Choir boys grew up. Some forgot. Some chose silence out of fear. Others sang the tunes in private, keeping them alive only within small circles. Unlike written music, oral music could vanish in a single generation if the chain broke. Yet even this vulnerability carried power. What was dangerous to record became safe when it lived only in the mind. No bishop could confiscate memory. No council could ban what it did not know existed. To remember was to resist, and every choir boy who held a forbidden tune became an unmarked guardian of history. Oral tradition also shaped the very sound of these hidden songs. Because they were not locked in ink, they evolved. A note stretched longer here, a cadence shifted there. The songs adapted to each generation, becoming living things rather than frozen texts. What we hear today in certain folk hymns and regional liturgies may be echoes of these oral survivals, softened by centuries, but still carrying the essence of melodies once judged unfit. The choir boy's memory shows us that preservation is not always about parchment and ink. Sometimes it is about breath, repetition, and the determination to carry sound forward even when silence is demanded. In this way, music lived where no archive could reach, hidden not on a shelf, but in the fragile vault of the human mind. Beneath the palaces of Vatican City lies one of the most guarded collections in the world, the Archivum Secretum, known to many as the Vatican's secret archives. Scholars granted access describe endless shelves stretching for kilometers, lined with manuscripts that cover every aspect of human history. But within this labyrinth, there are rumours of something even more hidden, a vault inside the archive itself, where certain musical works are said to rest under shelf marks no one can request. These entries appear in scattered catalogues, small notations without explanation, a number, a title half erased, a reference to a codex that no one has seen in centuries. To the outsider, these are just shadows of records. Yet to those who study them, they suggest the existence of a secret vault of Vaticanum, where melodies judged too dangerous or too revealing were locked away. Imagine a scholar in the 19th century leafing through an index in Rome. He finds a line that reads, "Cantus obscurus, shelf number faded, no cross-reference available." When he asks the librarian, the reply is polite but firm. That entry is not available for consultation. No reason given, no further questions allowed. The door is closed, the key never offered. Such denials are repeated across generations, creating an aura of mystery around the very idea of music hidden in the deepest shelves. The secrecy is not just about content, it is also about control. By allowing certain catalogue entries to remain visible but inaccessible, the archive reminds researchers that there are boundaries they cannot cross. The shadow of knowledge becomes more powerful than knowledge itself. People imagine what might be locked away, and in that imagining, the authority of the vault grows. Some believe the missing works include regional chant traditions erased during the unification of liturgy. Others suspect experimental compositions that used forbidden intervals or scales associated with folk healing practices. A few even whisper about codices containing maps embedded in chant, or manuscripts linking music with astrology and medicine in ways that challenge doctrine. Whether these theories are true hardly matters. What matters is that the Vault of Vaticanum is structured to keep questions alive without ever giving answers. The scholar sees the shelf mark, but cannot touch the shelf. The rumour gains weight simply because silence surrounds it. This method of concealment leaves no proof of censorship, only an endless chain of denials. Over centuries, the works themselves may have been destroyed or misfiled, yet the catalogue references remain like ghosts. They are the fingerprints of melodies that once existed but were locked behind a wall of bureaucracy. Today, the Vatican insists its archives are open to qualified researchers, yet even now the process is tightly controlled. You may request a manuscript by its exact title, but you may not browse freely, and if the work you ask for is among those shadow entries, the answer is always the same: not available. The Vault of Vaticanum is not only a place, it is a system, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful act of censorship is not burning a book, but leaving it on a shelf that no one is ever allowed to reach. In the 19th century, a small Benedictine abbey in Solesmes, France became the unlikely centre of a movement that promised to restore Gregorian chant to its pure form. The monks of Solesmes devoted their lives to combing through old manuscripts, comparing neumes, and piecing together what they believed was the original sound of medieval worship. Their work came at a time when the Church longed for unity after centuries of upheaval, and the idea of a clean restoration fit perfectly into that vision. But like every act of restoration, what Solesmes chose to revive also determined what would be left behind. The abbot spoke of recovering authenticity, but authenticity was a decision, not a discovery. Thousands of chant manuscripts from across Europe showed regional variations. Some were slower and solemn, others lively and ornamented. The Solesmes monks decided which versions matched their vision of purity. They smoothed out the jagged edges, silenced the ornamental flourishes, and produced editions that created the impression of a single, timeless tradition. In reality, they had curated a new standard, one that excluded centuries of diversity. Imagine a French village in the 15th century, where the local chant carried traces of folk rhythm passed down orally alongside the official books. That chant, preserved in a manuscript, would later be examined by Solesmes and judged inauthentic. It would never make it into the official restoration. The villagers' song, once living and real, became an anomaly, erased by the pursuit of uniformity. The Solesmes editions spread quickly, endorsed by popes, and printed in thousands of copies. By the early 20th century, they had become the chant most Catholics knew. To sing Gregorian chant meant to sing Solesmes chant, even if earlier generations had sung differently. The reset was complete. The restoration had given the world a sound, but it had also buried others in silence. Scholars today recognize the brilliance of the Solesmes project. Without it, much of chant tradition might have been forgotten altogether. Yet they also note that the restoration created a myth. It taught people that there was one correct Gregorian chant, when history shows there were many. The Solesmes sound was not a recovery of the past, but a reinvention for the present, shaped by the ideals of 19th century France, with its longing for order, clarity, and control. This story reveals the paradox of restoration. To bring something back, you must choose which parts to highlight and which to discard. Every act of preservation is also an act of exclusion. The Solesmes monks did not set out to erase history, but by selecting certain chants as authentic, they ensured others would vanish from memory. And so the reset became official. Gregorian chant, as we know it today, is not the untouched voice of the Middle Ages, but the curated echo of Solesmes. It is beautiful, yes, but it is also a reminder that even restoration can be a form of rewriting, where the sound of eternity is shaped by the hands of those who decide what should be heard and what should remain in silence. Step into a stone chapel built in the 12th century and sing a single note. The sound blooms, bouncing from wall to wall, lingering in the air long after the voice has stopped. The architecture itself becomes part of the music. But not every sound thrives in these spaces. Certain frequencies swell beautifully, while others vanish almost instantly. Swallowed by the stone. This is not just accident. Many churches were designed with acoustics that rewarded particular chants and quietly punished others. The room with perfect echo was both an amplifier and a censor. Builders in the Middle Ages may not have known the science of sound in the modern sense, but they understood its effects. Long, narrow aisles created resonance for low drones. High-vaulted ceilings let soaring melodies hang like incense in the air. A unison chant sung by monks would feel endless, filling the space with sacred weight. But a complex polyphonic line, with quick notes or sharp dissonances, would blur into mush, the words lost in echo. In this way, architecture trained the ear. Worshippers learned that slow, solemn chant sounded divine, while anything too lively or experimental sounded chaotic. The walls themselves acted as gatekeepers of acceptable sound. Imagine a choir trying to sing a folk-inspired hymn with rapid rhythms inside a Romanesque church. The echo would smear the syllables, turning the lively tune into noise. The priest would shake his head, declaring the hymn unfit. No one needed to issue a ban. The room itself erased the sound. Over centuries, this effect reinforced the dominance of Gregorian chant. It was not only theology that made it sacred, but acoustics. The chant's long lines and simple intervals thrived in stone halls where every note stretched like light through stained glass. Meanwhile, alternate traditions that depended on rhythm or harmony withered, not because they lacked beauty, but because they were unsuited to the rooms where faith was staged. Some cathedrals went even further. In Renaissance Italy, architects studied how to make chapels, where choirs could echo in stereo, their voices bouncing from side to side, like heavenly dialogue. These designs celebrated grandeur, but also reinforced control. The acoustics made scripture texts clear when sung in approved styles, while experimental tones dissolved into confusion. The room itself decided what survived. This raises an unsettling thought. How much of what we call sacred music is actually the sound of architecture rather than pure tradition. Did Gregorian chant dominate because it was divinely chosen, or because stone vaults made it shine while other music faded into silence? The room with perfect echo reminds us that censorship does not always wear the face of authority. Sometimes it is hidden in physics, in the way sound moves through space. The very buildings that lifted worshippers' hearts also shaped history by rewarding one kind of music and quietly erasing others. In those echoes, we hear not only devotion, but also the unseen hand of walls that chose what voices would last. There are names that appear briefly in the margins of music history, only to vanish without explanation. They belong to conductors, composers, and researchers who dug too deeply into archives or preserved melodies the Church preferred forgotten. Their work, often meticulous and fragile, ended up seized, misplaced, or absorbed into collections where no one could access it again. These figures left behind only fragments, whispers of what they might have uncovered. One such case is tied to an Italian maestro in the 18th century who began compiling a vast anthology of regional chants from Naples and Benevento. His notes suggest that he had discovered melodies that did not fit neatly into the official narrative of Gregorian chant. Before he could publish, his manuscripts were confiscated during a local inquiry into church music. He died suddenly soon after, and his name all but disappeared from official histories. Only a passing reference in a student's letter hints that his archive ever existed. Another story comes from the 19th century, when a German researcher was granted temporary access to portions of the Vatican archive. He reportedly copied pages that reference chants never catalogued elsewhere, but when he tried to present his findings to a university, the documents were dismissed as forgeries. Soon after, his copies went missing from his personal library, and no trace of the originals has ever resurfaced. His career collapsed, his reputation ruined, and his life ended in quiet obscurity. In France, a conductor in the early 20th century led a choir that specialized in performing obscure medieval works. According to rumors, his repertoire included chants sourced from manuscripts no one else had seen. After a performance that drew the attention of clerical authorities, his collection of scores was seized for review. He was assured they would be returned. They never were. Within a year, he closed his choir, his name slowly erased from concert programs, his music remembered only by those who had sung under his direction. These vanishings did not always involve violence or exile. Often, the erasure came through silence. Archives were locked. Manuscripts were reclassified. Individuals who had dedicated their lives to rediscovery simply found themselves without resources, without credibility, without voice. The system did not need to destroy them publicly. It only needed to remove their work and let time do the rest. What makes these stories haunting is that they follow a pattern. Each person uncovered material that challenged the neat continuity of official sacred music. Each sought to share their discoveries, and each was silenced, not by dramatic persecution, but by disappearance, the quiet folding of their lives into the shadows of forgotten files. The conductor who vanished is not one man but many, spread across centuries, bound by the same fate. Their loss reminds us that history is not only shaped by what survives, but by what is deliberately withheld. Somewhere in sealed vaults and misplaced shelves, their work may still lie waiting. But until the key is turned, their voices remain silent, their music unheard, their names little more than ghosts on the edge of memory. The Phantom Hymnal is not a book anyone has held in their hands. It is a ghost that appears only in fragments scattered across centuries, a cycle of chants whispered about in citations, scribbled in margins, and hinted at through psalm tones that never quite match the text they accompany. Piece by piece, scholars have tried to reconstruct it, yet the whole remains elusive, as if the hymnal itself were designed to slip through time without ever being fully caught. The trail begins with a letter from a 12th century abbot, complaining that certain hymns sung by neighbouring monasteries were dangerously irregular. He mentions melodies that stretched beyond the approved modes and verses that seemed to carry hidden references. No copies survive, but the mention alone suggests something once circulated that did not align with uniform liturgy. Centuries later, in a 15th century breviary, a monk's marginal note refers cryptically to Cantus de Libro Phantasma, the song from the Phantom Book. Was he joking, or acknowledging a tradition already slipping into legend? The fragments continue. In several surviving chant manuscripts, certain psalm tones appear mismatched to their texts, as if borrowed from a cycle no longer available. The melodies wander slightly out of step with standard practice, suggesting they belonged to a different order before being hastily transplanted. In one case, a set of tones in a Spanish codex perfectly fits a sequence of hymns that are otherwise missing, as though the music outlived its words. From these clues, researchers suspect that the Phantom Hymnal may have been a collection of chants that wove together scripture with encoded commentary, perhaps even carrying political or mystical undertones. If true, its disappearance makes sense. A hymnal that hinted at double meanings or carried knowledge outside church control would be quickly suppressed. Yet, suppression leaves shadows. Citations linger in correspondence. Marginalia preserves whispers. Psalm tones, too awkward to erase, survive as puzzle pieces waiting for a frame. Imagine a modern scholar poring over microfilm in a dim archive room, eyes catching a brief notation in faded ink. The words are mundane, a correction in Latin, but the melody above them bends strangely, echoing patterns found in another manuscript hundreds of miles away. The realization sparks like lightning. Two fragments, separated by geography and centuries, belong to the same lost cycle. Piece by piece, the Phantom Hymnal begins to reappear, not in full but in outline, like bones of a skeleton beneath shifting sand. This process reveals not only the possibility of a hidden hymnal, but also the fragility of memory itself. Music can be silenced, yet traces always remain for those willing to listen closely. The Phantom Hymnal is less an object than an idea, a reminder that even in eras of control, entire repertoires could exist between the lines, surviving not in the official record, but in the persistence of small mistakes, side notes, and inconvenient tones. It may never be fully reconstructed, but in the fragments we glimpse its ghost, proof that silence is never perfect, and that music, even erased, has a way of haunting the page. Stand in a cathedral while the choir sings a low, sustained note, and you can feel it before you hear it. The stone walls tremble slightly, the air thickens, and your chest vibrates as if the sound is inside you rather than outside. This is resonance, the physical power of vibration shaping human experience. Across cultures, certain frequencies have always been linked to the sacred, from the deep chanting of Tibetan monks to the ringing of massive bells in European towers. But in the hands of the Church, these vibrations became more than spiritual. They were carefully managed tools, designed to stir reverence and obedience, and sometimes even fear. Medieval theorists believed numbers, intervals, and tones were woven into the structure of the cosmos. A chant sung at the right pitch was not just pleasing, it aligned with the harmony of the heavens. Notes that vibrated with stone architecture created the illusion of divine presence. When people knelt in awe, they were not only worshipping God, they were responding to physics wrapped in ritual. The leaders of the Church understood this deeply. By rewarding frequencies that produced reverence and banning those that caused unease, they shaped what faith sounded like. Imagine a villager in the year 1200 entering a cathedral for the first time. Outside he heard folk songs, lively and quick, but inside he was engulfed by a vast drone echoing endlessly. The vibration entered his body, and he felt small, humbled, and certain he was standing before the infinite. The sound was not accidental. It was engineered by both music and stone to produce that effect. Over time, certain frequencies became inseparable from the idea of the sacred. Bells cast in bronze were tuned to resonate with entire cities, their tolls carrying miles across the countryside. When they rang, people felt not just called to prayer, but bound together under one sound. This unity was powerful, and the church knew it. A bell could signal celebration or terror. A chant could heal or unsettle. Frequencies became instruments of faith, but also of control. What began as resonance became weaponized reverence. This control is visible in what was excluded as much as what was embraced. Intervals judged unstable or rhythms tied to local dances were silenced because they did not create the right bodily response. They stirred excitement rather than stillness, passion rather than obedience. By restricting the soundscape, the church narrowed the range of emotions people were allowed to feel in sacred space. Sacred became synonymous with frequencies that bent the body toward submission. Yet the memory of other vibrations never fully died. Folk traditions carried their own resonant songs in secret, drumming patterns that lifted energy, chants that empowered rather than subdued. Even today, modern science studies how frequencies affect the brain and body, reviving questions once hidden under theology. The story of frequencies of faith shows that the sacred is not only about belief, it is about vibration. It is about how sound shapes flesh, how resonance becomes reverence, and how those who control the soundscape can guide not only what people hear, but also what they feel, and ultimately what they believe. When official channels closed and church authorities tightened control over music, some people turned to secrecy. Across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were whispers of groups who met not only to discuss philosophy or politics, but to share music that had no place in the choir stalls of cathedrals. These were the Masons, the mystics, and the wandering musicians who formed a kind of choir of secret societies, exchanging manuscripts under cover of night. Their meetings rarely left records, yet scattered hints survive in diaries, coded letters, and the odd manuscript bearing strange symbols in its margins. The Freemasons in particular became closely tied to music. Their lodges were filled with ceremonies that relied on song, and members often composed pieces that blended sacred and secular themes in ways the church would have frowned upon. Some of these works contained echoes of suppressed chants, smuggled into harmonies or woven into new compositions as acts of preservation. The lodge provided a safe space where forbidden intervals could still be sung without fear of censure. Mystical brotherhoods, like the Rosicrucians, took it even further, treating music as a pathway to hidden wisdom. They believed certain scales could unlock states of awareness, that chants carried knowledge passed down from antiquity. Their manuscripts, often disguised as prayer books, sometimes contained elaborate codes where notes spelled out philosophical messages. These societies kept alive traditions that the church had tried to bury, preserving fragments of sound as if guarding keys to forgotten worlds. Travelling musicians were another link in this underground chain. Moving from court to court, tavern to tavern, they carried scraps of melodies in their memories and pockets. Some were connected to secret groups, others simply served as messengers without knowing it. A wandering lutenist might carry a folio with ordinary dance tunes on the surface, but tucked between them, a page of chant not seen in any official hymnal. By night, in hidden rooms, these pages were shared, copied, and passed along to the next hand. Imagine a candlelit chamber in Vienna during the 18th century. A small group gathers around a table, the windows covered. A manuscript is placed at the centre. They sing softly, voices blending in a melody banned from public worship centuries before. For them, it is not just music, it is resistance. It is proof that truth can live outside the vaults of Rome. Such scenes remind us that secrecy was not only about politics or philosophy, but about sound. The choir of secret societies did not perform on public stages. They performed for each other, sustaining a hidden tradition where music became both prayer and protest. Much of what they guarded has been lost, yet their efforts left traces in the margins of history. Symbols carved into churches, unexplained motifs in classical compositions, or fragments of chant that reappear centuries later in unexpected places. Together, these clues suggest that the underground choir was real, and that even in the shadow of control, voices continued to rise in secret, carrying forward melodies meant never to die. In the 20th century, the invention of the recording studio changed everything. For the first time, music that had once lived only in the moment could be captured, replayed, and compared. This new permanence should have been a gift to historians, yet it also created new tensions. When choirs recorded chants or hymns that did not align with the official versions, problems began. Some recordings were quietly edited before release, others were withdrawn without explanation, and in certain cases, threats ensured that the so-called wrong versions never saw the light of day again. Imagine a small choir in Germany during the early 1950s. They record a set of medieval chants using manuscripts discovered in a local archive. Their sound is raw and haunting, different from the smooth, uniform style promoted by Solesmes. The record is pressed, a few copies sold, then suddenly recalled. Officially, the reason given is poor sound quality, but those who heard the early pressing knew it contained chants no longer sanctioned. The music was not wrong, it was simply inconvenient. Similar cases appeared elsewhere. In Italy during the 1970s, a group of musicologists recorded regional liturgical songs from mountain villages. Some of these melodies contained traces of ancient rites long absorbed or erased by the Vatican's standardized chant. The recordings were praised at first as cultural treasures, yet soon after the label faced pressure. Distribution halted, and the tracks vanished from catalogues. Today they exist only in private collections, passed between scholars like contraband. Even in the digital age, the pattern has continued. When online platforms began hosting rare recordings of alternative chant traditions, some clips disappeared overnight. Sometimes copyright claims were cited, other times no reason was given. Choir directors who had uploaded the material received quiet warnings that continuing could affect their careers. In one case, a university ensemble performing an obscure Renaissance mass received an anonymous letter urging them to reconsider making the video public. The message was clear without needing to name names. The studio meeting the sacristy revealed a clash between two worlds. The studio valued documentation, proof, and access. The sacristy valued control, continuity, and the careful shaping of memory. When these worlds collided, compromise came through erasure. Edits softened dissonances, takedowns erased traces, and threats silenced singers. To outsiders, it looked like technical housekeeping, but to those involved, it felt like history repeating itself. The old bands of the medieval era reborn in the modern age. The irony is striking. Technology that promised preservation also enabled suppression. Instead of fire-consuming manuscripts, it was contracts and claims that deleted sound. Instead of inquisitors at the monastery door, it was quiet phone calls from publishers or clerics. Yet the outcome was the same. Music deemed wrong disappeared before most people could hear it. What remains are scattered copies, half-remembered broadcasts, and stories of albums recalled too soon. When the studio met the sacristy, the old struggle over music did not end. It simply changed format, proving that even in an age of microphones and tapes, silence can still be manufactured with ease. For centuries, the story of sacred music has been told as if it were a straight line. Rome falls, Gregorian chant rises, uniformity reigns, and everything else fades into silence. But now, looking back through the hidden codices, the whispered traditions, the vanished recordings, we see that the line was never straight. It was bent, edited, and rewritten. Sound itself was shaped by those in power, chosen not only for beauty, but for obedience. The melodies that survived became official history. The ones that were banned, buried, or forgotten became shadows. And yet, those shadows still hum beneath the surface. Sound is not just vibration, it is memory. To sing a melody is to remember a moment, a people, a truth. That is why the suppression of music is more than censorship, it is the control of memory itself. Every chant erased meant a memory erased. Every song declared unfit meant a piece of human experience locked away. To free the songs is to free the memory, and to free the memory is to restore history. Think of the phantom hymnal that lives only in fragments, or the chants carried by choir boys long after their ink was banned, or the frequencies that vibrated through stone walls, making people feel close to God. Each of these shows us that sound can never be entirely silenced. Even when suppressed, it waits, hidden in margins, in echoes, in the minds of those who dared to keep humming. The final lesson is not about what the Vatican locked away, but about what listeners can do now. These lost songs are not relics, they are invitations. To hear them, even in fragments, is to glimpse the full picture of human history, not just the version written in official hymnals. To sing them again is to break the silence that has stretched for centuries. Imagine standing in a modern church, or even your own room, and singing a melody once judged forbidden. The sound fills the air, the same intervals vibrating as they did hundreds of years ago. In that moment, the past is not distant. It is alive again, freed from the vaults, restored not by authority, but by human voice. This is why the call is simple, yet powerful. Let the people sing. Let the melodies return not as museum pieces, but as living songs. Let them remind us that history is not only what is written, but also what is heard. If sound is memory, then singing is remembering together. And if enough people remember, no vault, no council, no silent archive can ever erase the truth again. The search must continue, in libraries, in recordings, in hidden archives. But more than searching, there must be singing, because only when the suppressed songs rise once more into the air will history itself begin to sound whole again.